Thank you very much, Nicholas, Mel, and Michael. Very interesting presentations. Before opening the discussion, I will provide some short thoughts and some additional transparency from myself. Nicholas showed the companies and the indications which we had so far with Tapestry for this parallel or multi-stakeholder consultation where we participated via scientific advice. From the very beginning, the agency made it clear that although we fully support and participate in all the Tapestry procedures, and we acknowledge Tapestry as being the one who broke the barrier between the regulators and the agency, as an agency, we are open, obviously, also to multi-stakeholder procedures where the company comes as a sole applicant. So far, we had 4 procedures from 3 big companies, completely different but big therapeutic areas: heart failure, asthma, rheuma, and food allergies. And we have some more announced. So this is the transparency I can have from my point of view. It is then for the companies to say more, perhaps. Perhaps one more information: I did not have a company who did both procedures, Tapestry and non-Tapestry, so far. So it is for you to provide feedback, not for me. Now, away from the procedures, I would like to go a little bit into the scientific part of these multi-stakeholder consultations. When I viewed the products across these many indications, and I tried to find a common denominator on these products, I concluded that actually in all the cases, the company aimed at disease modification, far beyond a short endpoint. Now, I was kind of disappointed this morning that perhaps you got the impression that risk-benefit discussion is something completely different than the added value. My experience so far in these many procedures I participated, 10 so far and the one announced by Tapestry, as Nicholas mentioned, is that there is a lot to share, and disease modification is something as a pharmacological concept which certainly is shared by the regulators and the HTAs. Disease modification is very important for risk-benefit because the level of risk we're going to accept depends upon what the product does and the disease modification, and obviously for the HTAs. This is on an abstract scientific level, but if we go down to the endpoints, my experience also during these many procedures is that many endpoints are common. The days in hospital, the number of hospitalizations, the patients return to the hospital. This is not like either risk-benefit or added value. My experience was that the majority was both. And yes, there were some questions when you ask about the economic model which is going to be used, then it's only for HTAs, perhaps it's only for certain HTAs, and we had such questions. But the majority of the questions could be shared, and there was a lot of mutual understanding among all participants. And now I open the floor for discussion. Questions? Yes, please.
I'm Alex West from GlaxoSmithKline. Thank you to all the speakers for a really stimulating presentation this morning. It's really encouraging, if not a bit awe-inspiring, to see the progress made in the last 2 years. Many of us in the room are global regulatory leads. We represent regulatory functions in industry on multidisciplinary teams. If you were in our position, perhaps each of you could give us some very basic advice.
So it's actually I presented to our Global Regulatory Affairs leadership team a few weeks ago on the HTA regulatory interface. And I think what's clear in companies is that when we sort of get separate advice, we go to the project team and we, from an HTA perspective, we say, actually, you need to build these components into the study design in order to satisfy the needs of payers and HTAs. The project team may respond quite well to that and say, oh, you know, great, okay, we'll look at incorporating those elements to ensure we can drive access. And then the regulatory person may step in separately and say, actually, there's a small risk to the regulatory file by taking that approach. And so sometimes the sort of the advice that's been brought into the project team that could have resulted in a change that would dramatically impact your access position could be sort of undone by the regulatory input saying there's a small risk to the trial. So I suppose what I'd say to regulatory affairs colleagues is, first of all, gaining a better understanding of the HTA position and the risk of the access risk, and then understanding how that balances against potential regulatory approval risk is really important, because actually if you can get approval but you don't get access, actually then that's bad for patients. So maybe a small regulatory risk is worth it if you can remove a lot of access risk. And I suppose the second thing I would say is I would encourage you to work closely in an integrated way with your payer and HTA colleagues. And if you can get to a point where you can jointly provide input to the project teams with a sort of consolidated input, then actually you'll remove that sort of back and forth between the two perspectives and you'll get to a better clinical development plan and outcome.
Thank you, Mel. Yes, more questions. Jeffrey?
Dave Jeffries from ASI and from Tappara. I think, can I again say, I think we've had almost four actually, excellent presentations today. The picture I'm getting, and over the last few years have got, is that we have two processes which are like trains which have been running on separate tracks. They're now coming together, and I think what we're seeing is the possibility of them perhaps running together on the same track. But I just wonder how far this process can go without either changing the legislation or a political will, because if we're eventually looking at joining the two trains together, there may be some difficulties around the legal framework. So that's question number one. And then the second question, more from a Tappara perspective, is if there are some of those difficulties, but equally there is a need for a common data set and understanding, what role does the panel see that perhaps Tappara, as an apolitical, membership-driven organisation, could perhaps play in helping to move the process to the benefit of patients, but recognising that legislative framework, particularly in present Europe, may not be so easy to achieve? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Very interesting question. Who would like to take it from the panel?
Okay. So while I think there's definitely two trains that are coming together, I think there's, I spoke a little bit about the idea of actually finding the common areas. And I think that's critical because there's still going to be areas which aren't alignable. I mean, economics is clearly one of those. Relative effectiveness at the sort of national level may always differ depending on what comparators are being used in different markets and also how the economic system works in different markets. So what I would sort of advocate is more really understanding the areas of commonality, like areas like relative efficacy, and getting solid alignment around those, and then at the same time understanding where there are differences that are unreconcilable and not trying to align those because actually it wouldn't make sense to do so.
Thank you. And Nicholas?
Sure. Well, what we have encountered in working with the various players to pull these consultations together is that there are obviously different levels of government organization, and not surprisingly, people in those institutions don't really want to either devolve their authority downward or to centralize their authority upward to the pan-European level. So that creates some natural resistance to a real formal shift in how decisions are made. The question of whether closer integration really requires a legal change is, I think, an open one. Certainly, if you start out from the perspective of these consultations, we believe that there is a potential platform that will make them broadly available without necessarily requiring any significant legislative changes.
Thank you, Nicholas. And if I may add also myself, I think it's a little bit too early to predict, although we have these positive signals for the time being. But I think it is, since it is a voluntary procedure, it is you who are going to show us whether and how you like it, because you're going to come back or not. Either you come to this platform or you go to MPA TLV in Sweden separately, because that's better. And this I find very pleasant, because you get the feedback from the companies whether this procedure is. Currently, the feedback is positive. And as Nicholas said, who is a lawyer also on top, so he has more. I think we can do a lot without jumping into the change of the legislation, which is a very big thing, and everybody will be quite reluctant for that. Yes, please.
This is a question for Mel and Nicholas. As one has done this kind of thing, and I say kind of thing in the past, looking at relative effectiveness, one gets into a discussion about therapy benefit or therapy effectiveness versus mere drug effectiveness. And you get into the old scenario of how you get the total cost of the existing therapy, because it encompasses many other costs than merely the drug. So if you take a drug, for example, to avoid a second MI, you want to factor in the cost of that second MI treatment, hopefully successful, into your calculations. So my question to both of you is, have you been able to get the HTA participants from the authorities around the table to start putting in some of those costs on a therapy basis as opposed to merely the drug cost?
I'll start on this. One of the upcoming consultations is focused on antibiotics and antibiotics for multi-resistant infections, which are likely to be held in reserve, in part may be used to conserve some other effective but threatened antibiotics. And I think that raises a very interesting question along the lines that you ask, which is how do you account for the full value of something like this? I don't think that simply sitting down once with the multiple stakeholders is going to solve that problem. I think there's a lot that companies need to do to advance a model of value that can then be debated and ultimately incorporated, particularly because the different HTAs have different levels of sophistication and different approaches to assessing this kind of benefit.
So I think it's a really good comment. I think clearly from a drug developer's point of view, we would like to see healthcare systems recognizing the broader value of products and the broader cost offsets that can be achieved, not just looking at drug costs. However, having said that, different HTAs take very different approaches in this area. Some will only look at direct drug costs, while others, like NICE, will consider a much broader range of costs. Sweden will even consider impact on social care budgets. So there's different degrees of silo approaches in different HTAs. And then you've got the difference between the national and the regional perspective. So at the national level, you may well get a consideration of the across silos, but then when you get to the regional level, that may not follow through. And you're even seeing, for example, some decisions made by NICE that say something is cost effective, and then at the regional level, the PCTs may actually see a cost saving argument, so they'll actually make that drug available. So I think it's an important area, but I don't think you're going to get that alignment through multinational, international multi-stakeholder advice, because also at the national level, the costs will differ as well. So the cost of a particular intervention in one market may be very different to another market because of the cost of the wages for the people who are doing that intervention. So I'm not sure it's going to happen internationally. It would be dealt with at the national level.
Thank you, Mel. And yes, I can say also that in our discussions so far in these procedures, we went, and the HTAs went beyond the cost of drug. of the drug, but, for example, how much a rehospitalization costs when you have to run everything through one patient and how many times patients come back. And a last question or comment from a CHMP member, Bert?
Thank you. My question goes to Michael. I was very pleased that you referred to the pharmacovigilance legislation. We will hear more about that this afternoon. But what we see very often when there is, for instance, a commitment of a company to do a post-approval study, but when the drug is not reimbursed in a certain country, well, the whole study is not feasible anymore. You know, when the company proposes a GPD study here in the UK, and NICE doesn't give a positive opinion, then the study is worthless because it's not feasible to do it, because the drug is not reimbursed, not used, so the study is gone. So I appreciate very much your comment on, well, there should be close alignment also between HTA decision-making, because HTA decision-making and the conduct of post-approval safety studies is not always on the same track.
It's a very good addition to what we discussed before, because it's not just defining a good study protocol, and it's not just defining the right framework, but also make it feasible, and having the early input in such discussion, both in terms of feasibility and at the same time, will the data be will it be used for HTA purposes later? That's the important discussion to be held at a very early stage, and I think that's a very important addition. I agree.
Thank you, Michael. And we just got from our Tappara organizer another 5 minutes for the discussion. He is there, Christopher. He thought probably it's very important. More questions? Yes, please. Somebody we cannot see, probably this room is...
Maria Arce Thomas from Abbott. You alluded, this was Nicholas and Mel, you both alluded to the difficulty from HTAs to predict the future in terms of, well, not medical needs perhaps to a large extent, but in terms of what the payers will be able to afford, how they will prioritize what they can pay for. I was wondering whether there is a very strong level of recognition about the need, though, to have some tools or protocols to address that issue, because indeed, when we come for consultation and advice, we really need to have their advice vis-a-vis the criteria for the future, so we don't get surprises later on.
Yes, I think it's a really good comment. I think what clearly they are having difficulties looking at the future scenarios, because payers and HTAs tend to be making decisions on what they're doing now, and they haven't got experience of doing early advice, so they haven't got into the habit that regulators have done of looking into the future. So I think, I mean, what we're doing internally is thinking more about when we go for HTA advice, really starting to build up the scenarios, pulling together all the information that we have on evolving therapies and how the treatment pathways will change over time, so that when we go to them for advice, we're almost presenting in a sort of more of a current scenario based on what might happen in the future, that they can then respond to more effectively.
Yeah, Mel, to build on that a bit, when we were working up to the recommendations and then the design of these consultations, there was a sense among some of our industry colleagues and some clinicians that, well, gosh, why won't the HTAs just tell us what they want? And I think we came to the conclusion that they're not really sure what they want in 5 years, and they've never really been asked that in a way that compelled them to respond. Part of the learning process that is entailed by these kinds of engagements is to create an opportunity and really the pressure for that kind of thinking, and it's a gradual process.
And one thing I would add to that is, I mean, the HTA community is clearly interested in becoming better at offering early scientific advice and joint advice. And the HTAI, which is an international society of HTA organisations globally, has established an interest subgroup looking specifically at these type of interactions with a view to sort of looking at the quality indicators and how do they improve the quality of the early advice that they're offering.
And I think Mel is leading that subgroup, is that right?
That is correct.
Thank you. And before we take the last question, perhaps I can give like a personal tip on that. It is for you to make the case, and we will discuss questions. For example, you can say that you know the pipeline, everything is published, you know what is in phase 2, phase 3. You can have a question saying, assuming this product, which is not approved currently, will be available for this indication, will this trial, etc., etc. So for this, I think everybody is willing to work with a higher degree of assumptions in order to make it more useful for you. And the last question now.
Yeah, this is Carl Bergen from Maxia Strategies. It's clear from the presentations the benefits that can be derived from these consultations, particularly for Big Pharma, where you have the opportunity to see the project from very early all the way through to the market. Many of the companies I work with are small companies with business models that are looking at trade sale or licensing out at proof of concept. What advice would you have in the smaller companies taking advantage of these consultations and building them into their phase 2 programs?
Well, that is I think, a great question, because it's one of the big motivators in our work to create an institutional platform that kind of lowers the cost, lowers the complexity of having access to this kind of forum. That said, there's likely to be some way of limiting the number of these consultations that go through just because of capacity constraints, although there are differing opinions on that. So a solution, if I have one, is to watch this space. Hopefully there will be an institutional platform that will make this more available.
I think it's even more critical for smaller companies to go through this process, because smaller companies may not have as well developed parts of the organization that are looking at access considerations. So going through this will give them perhaps an increased level of learning than some of the big companies may obtain. And I'd also encourage you to think about actually some of the national parallel advice processes which are being offered, which are actually very competitively priced in terms of the, compared to some of the other multinational offerings. So, and they can still give you some really good insights.
Thank you very much. Yes, I fully support that. Although I'm obviously working in the centralized scientific advice, I always thought, not only for the HTA advice, also for the regular scientific advice, that in Europe we can only be strong in the centralized scientific advice if we are strong in the national scientific advice. And it is the same for the HTA. So it is for you to use, and the small companies, as correctly said, they can choose to go via a national procedure, for example, as an option. It is, now we'll give the floor to Angelica for last comments, and we will close the session.
Well, thank you very much to all my speakers for this very interesting session, and to all the audience for these very interesting questions. I think one question which was not answered actually by David was, what could Tappara do in the future in this area? And I think just holding sessions like this for all of us to learn more about these new areas and how we are going to communicate with each other. So watch the space and watch the Tappara program offerings. Thank you very much.
Thank you.